Hello, my friend. I was woken up at 5 o'clock by my own internal clock, and my internal clock said it's time for you to get up and start thinking. And so I was thinking this morning about trauma. And for some people, and for some instances, when we go through trauma, we tend to hyper-identify with trauma. Like, this trauma really changed my life in a harsh way, and I'll never be the same because of it. And we continue to give credit to that trauma for the way we are. That's one end. And then another thing that we sometimes do is we unidentify with the trauma in terms of how it affected us. So sometimes we hyper-identify and then sometimes we unidentify. And unidentifying means that you went through a trauma and you said, oh, it's fine because everything worked out in the end. It's fine. Like God helped me through it. It's okay. Neither of those are healthy though, because when we go through trauma, what needs to happen is we go through the trauma, and not a lot of times we have control over most of the things that happen in the trauma. And so it's usually at the end of the trauma that we finally are able to process. And if we don't take time to process in the trauma or immediately after the trauma, then what we tend to do is these traumas just get stuck, and they affect our minds constantly. They affect our bodies constantly. Our emotions affect our stress level, which affects our body. So I want to share with you my birth story with my last baby. His name is Joshua. He was born about 21 months ago. And so I just want to share you, first, I want to share with you the story about like what I thought the birth story was at that time. And then I want to share with you what I've realized from the birth story after having processed it. And so here goes. So my son came 3 weeks early. I wasn't ready for it. He was born at home. It was, the birth went smoothly. He wasn't breathing right after birth, so he had to go to the hospital where they monitored him for less than 24 hours. And then he was able to come home and life is good. I was able to resume appointments and homeschooling and everything that I do, and life was pretty good. And that's how it went. But if I were to tell you after having gone through the processing, I could go on for literally a half hour telling you about every single trauma that happened to me during that. I'm just going to highlight a few. There were many, many micro traumas, but the few biggest traumas that I went through, that in the moment I told myself, it's okay, it'll be fine, and then lasted over a year of repeated trauma to my body because I didn't process it correctly, was this. So my baby came very early. I wasn't prepared. I was exhausted before I even went into labor. Ended up going into labor. After he was born, I literally felt like I was dead, like dying. Like I knew I was still in my body, but I was completely disconnected from what was going on in the room. I could observe what was going on in the room but not feel anything. I didn't feel anything. And I knew my baby was on my chest. I knew, there were things going on, but I was literally like I could have died. And I remember in my mind thinking, okay, God, take me home. I've done my part. I've done my work on earth. I brought these kids into the world. I can go now. Like, just take me. I'm ready. Like, that's how traumatic it was. Okay. Then, my baby's not breathing. So they take him to the hospital. And in that moment, I wake up and I'm like, oh, like, I've got to get my rear in gear and get up. And they're like, you've lost over a gallon of fluids. They gave me a Pitocin shot in my leg. I did what I had to do to get up and follow my baby to the hospital. Follow my baby to the hospital. They put him on oxygen, all that. I'm sitting there with him and he's crying, he's periodically waking up and crying. He hadn't eaten since he was born because of the breathing. And so my heart broke, like literally broke, that I couldn't feed him because he was stuck, on oxygen. And, he wasn't hooked up to any tubes for feeding or anything. So he was hungry and I couldn't feed him. And so that was heartbreaking. That crushed part of my heart. And then another thing was, they went, once he was finally off oxygen, they wouldn't let me hold him and sleep because they don't let you hold your baby and sleep at the hospital. So I didn't sleep all night because there was no way I was letting go of my baby. And then the next day, I had to, wait and wait and wait for my husband to get to the hospital. Once he finally showed up, I was able to finally go to the bathroom for the second time after having a baby and, and eat something. And then, all the hoops and trying to jump all the hurdles to get him out of the hospital so he could get home so I could sleep because I was exhausted. I literally started having an emotional and psychological breakdown. I literally did. But I didn't tell my husband at the time because I knew if I told him, my brain is breaking literally. He would have said, "Go home. You shouldn't even be here. I don't want to have you admitted to the hospital, so you need to go home now." And I wouldn't have. I would have fought to be by my baby's side. So I literally went through a mental breakdown. And then after we finally got home and my mom had driven all night to be there, which bless her heart, I love her for that. I was able to get home and I was able to start recovering. And, but when I got home from the hospital, I couldn't even look my other children in the eye. I was so broken. So like I could not handle another emotion without going another level into a mental and emotional breakdown. So then after that, my baby struggled with asthma. So I was his constant care provider for that while trying to recover myself and doing homeschool and doing all this other stuff with my kids and my appointments and everything else I needed to do. And and I had postpartum depression. And it took me 8 months before I realized it was from the Pitocin. And so once I finally antidoted that with homeopathy, I was fine. But that was the beginning of my healing because that showed me that I had not healed. I had not healed from the birth. I had not healed from the trauma. And so it was only about 8 months to a year after he was born that I started actually healing from the trauma. And I share that with you not so you have pity on me because that's not what I came for. I've already gone through the work and processed all of this stuff. But I do share this with you because I feel like sometimes we go through hell, literal hell. Sometimes we go through the worst and unimaginable. But because it ends well, or because things worked out, or because we feel like we have to have that stiff upper lip or smile on our face for somebody else, it doesn't mean that we are not breaking down inside. And so while I think it's healthy for us to not hyper identify with something and say, because of that, my whole life is ruined, because of that, my whole life is different, and my life would have been better if it hadn't been for this. As good as it is to not hyper identify on that end, it's also not good to say it's all okay, everything's okay when it's not okay. So if you are dealing with trauma, maybe you don't realize it's trauma. Maybe you just have a health condition that you can't trace back to anything and medical practitioners can't find the answers behind it or sufficient evidence, just that you have this diagnosis now. Then maybe it's time to start the internal healing process as well. And so anyway, I just want to validate you that you are listened to, your voice is worth hearing. I understand that there are times in our lives where we feel like if we speak up, people are going to think differently than we want them to of us. They might say that we're not mentally stable, things like that. If you've ever been told that or been fearful of somebody telling you that, there's this type of emotional work for you to do and psychological, healthy, natural, holistic work to do. In addition to any other treatments and medical care you need, there is also healing that can happen, not just managing symptoms, but actual healing. And so yeah, if you feel like this resonates with you, feel free to reach out to me. Feel free to reach out to me. I want to hear you. I want you to know your voice is heard. And take care, my friend. I hope you have a fantastic week.